So today I'm gonna pass it along to Ben so he can
Yeah,
give us a nice intro on our presenter, please.
yeah. I'm also blown away that Keanu Reeves showed up more than once. Um, okay, so I just wanted to be able to introduce Paul because I have a personal connection to him. So Paul Michalik is the currently the clinical professor at the University of Denver, where he teaches a plethora of courses, but on the foundations and practice of education. He is known for leading retreats on professional development, and he's got experience with a variety of audiences, including clergy, healthcare providers, community activists, and of course, educators. He's a Circle of Trust facilitator with the Center for Courage and Renewal. He's also an active blogger, and we'll be dropping in a link to his blog in the chat in a moment here, where he continues to explore the calling to teach in contemporary education. It's a great read if you have time. And in 2015, Paul was named the University of Denver's Distinguished Teacher, which is a really high honor, and it was well deserved. But in summary, he's got 40 years of experience teaching. He's a master educator. On a personal note, again, I'd never had a course like Paul's until I took Paul's courses, and I haven't had one like it since. So I'm just so excited that we get to all be here together to see Paul shine and Paul do his thing, and that we all get to have these great experiences with Paul. So with that, I would love if we could all give Paul a warm welcome. Yay, Paul. Thanks so much for being here. And I'll pitch to you, Paul.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Ben. Waiting to have the opportunity to be empowered to do the screen share. Now I have control. Okay, so oops. Let me go back one. All right, so thank you, Ben, for that lovely introduction. Even after 40 years of teaching experience, I always get nervous and simultaneously excited about this kind of work. So thank you. And so just you already know this basic structure, but we did our announcements, our icebreakers, and Sandra, thanks for kicking things off. Love the energy, love the attentiveness to feedback. Got about a 25-minute presentation and around healing and wellness, particularly around trauma and loss. I mean, Sandra's spot on. Goodness gracious, what a year, personally, professionally, and in the world itself. We'll be doing a little bit of reflective writing during that time, so just to begin to put that in the back of your head to kind of warm up your brain for that kind of experience, and I'll frame it up. And then we'll do the breakout rooms, and then we'll have our discussion. I'm looking forward to seeing where you take some of the ideas I'm sharing with you. Want to just say thank you for the invitation to be here, particularly to Andrea and Ben for setting this up for me, and again, Sandra for kicking us off. It's really helpful to have a warm start. But most importantly, I want to thank all of you who are here on this call today, all 88 of us so far, just to take the time for yourself, just to give that gift of being present to the possibilities that might exist for you today in general, but certainly in the context of our conversations around healing and wellness, especially as it relates to yourself, but certainly as it might spin off to other folks. I appreciate you taking the time to hear my observations on healing and wellness, which I'm sure will dovetail with a lot of what you heard last week with Ellie's presentation on stress and burnout, and particularly the concept of burnout. And I'm going to introduce a modification of that called moral injury. So we'll just a little bit of a foreshadowing of what is coming down the pipe for you. But let's start with on a wellness journey with just a simple breathing exercise. Breathing is one of the most basic elements of life, and therefore I think sometimes I can forget, and I know teachers I work with can sometimes forget the importance of breathing as well. It's the body's way of responding to stress. It can help energize and metabolize anxiety and move it and in a more productive direction towards wellness. And it facilitates healing and attentiveness in the presence to self and the presence to others. And conversely, not breathing or shallow breathing can have that opposite effect, that it can trigger the amygdala, what's often known as that lizard brain, the oldest part of our human consciousness. The amygdala is particularly good at sensing danger, whether it's physical danger, emotional danger, psychological danger, and it can do what is called the amygdala hijack, which is to take over all functions of the body, including the rational brain. And so breathing can help signal the amygdala to slow down, to back off, to calm, which can reduce the energizing influence of the fight, flight, or freeze. And so, and I've practiced breathing with my students, and I know that it works. Given my slightly heightened state of anxiety, I would appreciate a chance to do a little breathing, and I invite you into that as well. So invite you into just basically 3 simple breaths with me. And there are no right ways, there are no wrong ways. There's just breathing, just simple breathing. And I learned this technique from Resmaa Menakem in his book, My Grandmother's Hands. So if that's something you're interested more about, I'd recommend that particular text. But so again, there are no right ways, there are no wrong ways. I invite you to close your eyes if that's something that's comfortable to you. Keep your eyes open if that's better for you as well. Maybe put your hands on the tabletop or your chair, wherever they're comfortable, feet on the floor or feet on your chair, whatever is most comfortable for you. Just move your body into a state of comfort. And we'll begin. So with this first breath, just breathe in deeply and hold for a second. And just be present to your body. And then breathe out slowly. Second breath, again, breathe in deeply. Fill your lungs to the fullness of its capacity. Where's your body tight? Where is it loose? Feel your body and then breathe out slowly. And then this last breath, breathe in as deep as you can again and hold. And forcefully push out the air. Thank you. That helps me feel more settled and more centered. So thank you for doing that. So the question that I've been holding for quite a while is, and certainly in more contemporary times, what's going on in the world, particularly the world of teaching and leading, where healing and wellness and well-being is a concern? So why is that a topic that I want to raise for you all today? And I want to start with a quote from a teacher that I had the lovely opportunity to work with about 20 years ago. And I asked her, describe for me the state of your teaching. And remember, this is 20 years ago, and how much has changed since then. I think it's just been more intensified. But she, in her response to her question, I still remember it obviously clearly to this day. She answered in response to my question, all the joy has been tested and legislated away. All that's left is sand and dust. All that's left is sand and dust. And that just broke my heart. Elicited in me the sense of the need for some healing. And then if we move forward more into contemporary times, we know that the certain factors that are going on in schools with respect to teachers that just can ramp up pressure and anxiety for teachers, such as the pay for performance move, the value added model for teacher effectiveness, the metaphor of teacher as a machine, you just plug and play, and the whole teacher accountability movement has just, again, increased stress and anxiety, I think, for teachers, resulting in high rates of attrition, or even worse, cynicism. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, in more recent times, we have COVID, we have the necessary marches for racial justice, the death of the murder of George Floyd. We have the climate crisis, the presidential election, political discord, and then, you have your own daily personal challenges of navigating a changed world and profession. So there's a lot going on. Teaching has always been tough, but it seems particularly tough and challenging now, emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically. So I know Ellie last week talked about burnout, but I think it's actually perhaps even tougher than burnout. And for some people, it's more demanding and has perhaps crossed the boundary from burnout into what is oftentimes now called moral injury. And moral injury is a concept that's coming out of some psychology and some counseling worlds now. It's when somebody is asked to continuously violate or bend their moral and ethical principles over and over again. And typically some good examples of that could be soldiers or doctors or teachers, clergy. So folks who, so recently I was working with a group of doctors and thinking about their oath to serve and care for people. But like teachers, a lot of medicine has been commodified and the economic bottom line is what's most important. And physicians can find themselves being forced to make decisions that may go against their best instincts on what's the most healing and helpful for their patients. And so this line between the moral and ethical and spiritual or professional boundaries begins to get blurred. And people can end up they can end up feeling separated as if they're two different people. They're the person acting in the world because it's their role, and then they're also the person who was drawn into the profession because of their passions and commitments. And so they can begin to live a divided life, and psychologically and emotionally that can be quite traumatic. It can be injury, moral injury. So burnout, I think in contrast, burnout focuses the challenge and the solution on individual teachers. That says, oh, you can solve this problem yourself. And in many cases you can. I don't want to dismiss that framing, but in some cases it goes beyond just the individual, and actually moral injury begins to pull into the conversation and the question, what's the role of the system in this? How is it conspiring to my own diminishment? And as Ellie pointed out last week, stress kills the body, and as I'm suggesting, it can actually kill or damage the soul as well, the heart and passion of educators. Some of the things that we know about stress is the stress levels, as they rise, so do the levels of cortisol, which is the stress hormone, which elevates blood pressure, heart rate, that fight or flight. It triggers that amygdala, shuts things down, closes off possibilities. We know from the data that 46% of teachers express high levels of stress, and that was 2016, but 5 years ago. It's only gotten, I'm sure, more extensive than that. So stress and burnout, loss of motivation, loss of engagement, sort of depletion of self and self energies and directions. So let me talk a little bit about, so what is healing? Or what is wellness? And how might it address the burnout or the moral injury question that I was just raising? And how might this framing of our lived experience around healing, how might it lead to a deeper sense of well-being and presence for self and presence for others? So first off, I think it's important for me, and I want to share with you, that healing is a process. It's not an end state. It's ongoing. It's a practice. It's a discipline, and it acknowledges pain and loss, frustration, disappointment, rather than pushing it to the background. Recently, I read a book by a gentleman named Belden Lane. He was writing a lot about pain and loss, and he writes, "In the beginning, you weep." And I'm thinking, as I'm reading that, I'm thinking of that teacher early at the start of my presentation. who says that all the joy has been tested and legislated away, and all that is left is sand and dust. So in the beginning you weep. Then it becomes and the starting point is grief, the place where endings seemed so absolute. And so from that place of endings becomes the place of beginnings. And that's what I think healing offers as a metaphor, is that it takes that loss, it takes that pain and begins to move it towards, doesn't diminish it, it doesn't deny it, but it moves it energetically towards something that's productive and energizing, and offers a reforming of self in place. I think it's interesting for me, I offer for you, just to think about the difference between healing and curing, or being healed and being cured, that they're really two different things. And this is why I think healing is a better image. Because to be cured is to be released or resolved of all symptoms. It's a complete and permanent solution. There's no suffering, there's no loss. It's almost a return to that pre-state. And it doesn't really do well with loss. In contrast, to be healed is to experience well-being in the presence of suffering. Thinking of like a scar that I might have on my body. The scar doesn't go away. It's still present. The scars on the hearts of that teacher who was experiencing such pain and suffering, that doesn't go away, but it can be reformed and reformatted. She can be made, I guess to be made is not the right word, but she can be invited towards greater wholeness and the integration of loss as a way of moving towards towards health. So healing is often a deeply personal journey towards wellness and well-being. It's a discipline requiring constant attention, whereas curing or being cured often requires an external source of authority. So I think there's a big difference between self-authority and external authority when it comes to healing and being more fully present to yourself and to others. So the question then that I invite you to think about is, where can one turn for energy that's needed for healing and to incorporate pain in productive ways? I think one place to begin is to think about healing as being in relationship to something that is greater than self. To be in a relationship to something that's greater than self, and it can have spiritual roots. It can have moral roots. It can have community roots. So being in relationship to something that's greater than self, which allows for the healing to occur with the self, but also outside of the self. And two particular sources of healing, I think, can come from the inner self, which variously goes by various spiritual values, beliefs, notions of transcendence, and it may or may not include religion, but that sort of sense that there's an embodied energy in self that's greater than our particular role or particular place in society. But also those external sources that one can be in relationship that are greater than self can also come from external or outer sources as well, such as the secular moral world, the ethical world, or the legal world. It's just this notion of that you're not alone, that there's something bigger out there that you can connect with and that can help energize and heal. There's also a whole series of healing practices that one can turn to in terms of the inner dimensions of self: mindfulness, meditation, prayer, yoga. I know lots of people engage in those things on a regular basis. And there's also the outer notions of critical reflection or stress management or taking a principled ethical stances. So those are all sources one can turn to in terms of this healing journey. So what are some of these concrete models? So I've given you some abstractions, so to speak, or some theoretical framings. But what are some concrete models? And I want to just share a couple of them just to make it perhaps more real and a place that you can envision either yourself or others moving into. And I want to start with a couple of inner models and then move to a couple of outer models. So Parker Palmer is an educator, writer, activist, social justice promoter. And he uses the metaphor of the 4 seasons to think about the professional journey and the way that one's role in one's life as an educator can connect with the larger forces of the world, the 4 seasons. You know, we just have moved into the fall season. So he talks about these 4 seasons. So starting with I would invite you to think about metaphorically these 4 seasons as markers of where you are in your current professional journey. So it may not correspond to the actual season itself, but the metaphor of the fall, the metaphor of the spring, the summer. So the fall is a time for seeds. It's a time for nature to gather up its most precious resources. So the question oftentimes educators can ask in the fall of their season is, what's most important to me? What is it that I want to guard away? And then winter is, of course, a time of dormancy. It is a time of loss. It's a loss of perhaps things that are not important. But it's also a time in nature when things can be seen anew and different. I know when I'm walking in the woods of winter, I can see things I did not see in the lushness of summer. So what is it? So the winter of your season, rather than looking at it as a time of complete dormancy and loss, what are those opportunities that are emerging for self-reflection? And then just for timely purposes, I won't spend too much more time on spring or summer, but you can imagine spring is an envisioning of things flourishing and exploding. And sometimes not always beautifully, because I know the mud season can be quite nasty as well. So what is the spring of your professional journey? And then moving down to Laura Rendon, she wrote a book called Sente Pensate, where she was drawing from her Mayan and Aztec traditions in her cultural background to ask the question, how do competing things in a person's life, especially in the world of education, how do they come together in a vision of wholeness? And the process that she describes is called defrasissimo, which is to take these competing interests and energy and roll them up into something that's integrated and whole. It doesn't deny either parts of the conversation, but it integrates it. So for instance, rather than thinking about students and teachers as conflicted spaces, in the defrasissimo process, the question becomes, what is the unifying concept above student and teacher that brings them into a proper relationship with each other? And for me, I think that's collaboration. To think about collaboration as a way of unifying student and teacher without denying the individual energy and power of both. Or for instance, the 2 words of autonomy and rules, what unifies that? For me, it would be community. So there's from the inner world, Parker's work and Laura's work, I think are helpful concrete examples. In the external outer world, a lot of emphasis nowadays on social emotional learning for students. I recently wrote a paper with a grad student where we turned the question around and said, what would happen, in what ways can paying attention to the social emotional learning of teachers, in what way can it help them advance their work? And we were particularly looking at the role between social emotional learning and culturally responsive pedagogy. And so we found that teachers that are more centered on their own social emotional learning, those 5 elements of social emotional learning, had greater capacity for being attentive to their students with respect to culture and differentiation. Jonathan Haidt, a guy writing in positive psychology and education, talks about this metaphor of the elephant and the rider as a way of thinking about human consciousness. If you think about a person sitting on top of an elephant, the person sitting on top is the rational mind, the place of reason, but underneath that person walks this much more ponderous and stronger and robust animal called the elephant, which is our emotional center. It's our second brain. he would say it's actually our first brain, our gut brain. And if you know anything about elephants, when they get a little bit frightened or scared, they can just run through the bush, and they're going to take the mind anywhere they want it to go. And so thinking about the need for the importance of in instructional spaces and in personal spaces, taking care of that social and emotional needs. I once recently heard a teacher talk about the importance of Maslow before Bloom's. Maslow before Bloom's. Social and emotional before higher order thinking. So there's just a couple of examples. I want to move into some quick comments about some practices. I want to make sure to give you all some time to actually practice some of the stuff that I'm sharing with you. But excuse me. So the question is, why do these models work? Why do those previous models that I shared with you work? What are they drawing from that we can extrapolate and use in our own current practice? And what they're drawing from is that the language of the mind is reason, but the language of healing and the language of the heart is mystery. And so if we want to heal, we want to be able to draw on that heart and emotional and spiritual energy, whether it's coming from the outer or inner. And a couple of great places to do that is through poetry, music, and the arts. Emily Dickinson has famously written, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind." That sense of coming in sideways in terms of learnings and understanding. That's the language of the heart. The heart always comes in sideways. Community is a great place to begin to create stories. Stories are another way of telling a personal truth that has universal applications through that sideways imagery. David Byrne, singer-songwriter, talks about metaphor and mystery. He says, "I sense the world might be more dreamlike, metaphorical, and poetic than we currently believe. The world isn't logical, it's song. The world is essentially more of an elephant than it is the rider." And then finally, the notion of paradox. The paradox are two contrasting energies or forces or ideas that have equal weight. And it's not a matter of reconciling one or the other. It's a matter of integrating and pulling the two together into a wholeness. The physicist Niels Bohr once wrote, "The opposite of a fact is a falsehood, but the opposite of one profound truth may very well be another profound truth." So those are just a couple of exemplars of the way that poetry and music and the arts can create a healing space in the ways that more rational and linear and objective stances just cannot. That's just not the nature of that tool and that work. Just lost track of myself for a second. So I want to give you an opportunity to do a little bit of work around the heart and a little bit of work through the use of poetry. It's an invitation to experience those entry points, as Emily Dickinson would say, to experience sideways thinking. And through poetry, it invites the heart into the healing process. And it is a way of being interpreted. So as I write here, poetry has a way of interpreting the listener, even as the listener is interpreting the poem. So that's being in relationship to something greater than self, a great piece of poetry in this regards. When I'm working with teachers or other professionals, I often say that poetry is like a Rorschach test, psychological Rorschach test, and that you can hear in there what you most need to hear, and that will help you with the healing process. And just as a note, reading poetry for healing is not quite the same as reading poetry for high school or college, where the goal is often to dissect and disconnect from the hidden meaning that the poet has. So in a second, I'm going to read you a poem. And if I can, I'll pull it up and share it on the screen so you can have access to it. But I want you to invite you just to listen for a word, an image, or a phrase that speaks to you about wholeness and healing, especially in this time of trauma and loss as a teacher. What word, image, or phrase grabs your attention? You may not even know why, but just to listen to it. I invite you to set aside that analytic mind, to calm that rider on top of that elephant, and open your heart. You can jot down words, images, or phrases that grab your attention. Note the wisdom that's of integration that might be emerging for you. And there are no right or wrong answers. There's just learnings that bring you closer to your own wellness and to your own personal well-being. So here's the poem, and I'll read it, and then what I will do, it's a poem by Mary Oliver called Wild Geese. And then I'm going to give you, after this, I'm going to give you, let's see, about 5 minutes to do a little bit of free write, and I'll pull up those reflection questions and have them available to you. So you can do a little bit of free write, and then we'll move into some breakout rooms. So again, the invitation is for a word, an image, or phrase that speaks to you about wellness and wholeness in this time of trauma. This is Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. So here are some reflection questions for you to think about over the next little while here. Let's go for about to a quarter of, and then we will regroup. So some silent reflection around words, images, or phrases that sparked your imagination around healing, or perhaps diving into one or more of these questions. Okay, let me invite you out of this brief moment of reflective writing and just encourage you, if you've found a life-giving thread to follow, either in the poem or in one of these prompts, I invite you to continue today or tomorrow, or whenever you find the time and space to continue exploring that relationship between the words of Emily Dickinson, of Mary Oliver, her words, the metaphor of wild geese, in your own process of healing and coming into wellness and well-being. I think at this point in time, Sandra, am I right? We'll transition to breakout rooms. Echo and Crush team, just a couple little closing thoughts for you all. And one is, I know in a couple of the groups I popped into, people were talking about poems or music or other sort of artistic representations that they have in their classroom to remind them about their own heart and their own center and passion. And if you're interested in that kind of stuff, I would highly recommend a book called Teaching with Fire. Teaching with Fire by Sam Entrader and Meg Scribner. And in that book, what they did is they sent out a message across the country to teachers to say, what in times of stress and times of turmoil, what pieces of poems or wisdom stories do you turn to, and why? And so this book on one page has the poem or wisdom story, and then the other page, just a short narrative from the teacher about why they chose that particular poem, and then of course organized by theme. So just a lovely, lovely resource for building heart capacity. But I want to just end with two separate things. One is great, now you can see it. Just an invitation. If you found something helpful in the work that we did today, and some of the, trying to move this, there we go. So if you found some of the work that we were doing today helpful, some of the ideas helpful, if you want to come together in a group of educators or leaders exploring more of this relationship between the inner life and our outer roles and capacities, I'll be sending out a short survey, just a couple of questions, and if you're interested in it, just respond to that survey, or you can respond to me directly at paul.michaelek@du.edu, and I'll start pulling together a group of folks who want to explore this work. And what it means would be we come together some kind of regular time, whether it's once a month, every 2 weeks, we can figure that out. And we'll spend about an hour doing the kind of work around a piece of poetry or wisdom story that I only gave you 5 minutes to do. So if that's something that interests you, then please take advantage of that. And then the last thing I want to do is, as we're being sent forth, is to send you forth with a gift poem. Just one last little sideways look at the world that might help with your healing and your own wellness and well-being. This is a poem called Burlap Sack by Jane Hirschfield. And just as a side note, the reason why I like to read poems is because poems are meant to be read. I know you all can read, but really hearing it with your ears opens up the capacity for the heart to hear as well. So that's why I like to read poems aloud. So Burlap Sack by Jane Hirschfield, just as a sending forth. A person is full of sorrow the way a burlap sack is full of stones or sand. We say, hand me the sack, but we get the weight. Heavier if left out in the rain. To think of the stones or the sand as the self is an error. To think that grief is the self is an error. Self carries grief as a pack mule carries the side bags, being careful between the trees to leave extra room. The mule is not the load of ropes and nails and axes. The self is not the miner, nor builder, nor driver. What would it take? What would it be to take the bride and leave behind the heavy dowry? To let the thin-ribbed mule browse in tall grasses, its long ears waggling like the tails of two happy dogs. And so I just leave you all with that thought, where it might take you in your own healing journey. And thank you for attending to yourself and attending to others today. Blessings on your journey.
For more information about Project Echo and upcoming Echoes with the University of Denver, please visit mortgage.du.edu/echo or follow us on Twitter at echo_du_MCE. Thanks for watching.